It's 4:45 in the morning on July 7th, 1944, and an American soldier in a foxhole on Saipan hears something that makes his blood freeze. Through the darkness comes a low, rumbling sound, thousands of voices chanting together, getting louder and closer. Then he sees them, wave after wave of Japanese soldiers emerging from the jungle, screaming, some carrying rifles with bayonets, others holding nothing but swords or sharpened sticks. There are so many that they block out the horizon. 3,000 men are charging directly at American lines in the largest banzai attack of the Pacific War. The American soldier raises his rifle and starts shooting, but for every Japanese soldier who falls, 10 more take his place. The human wave just keeps coming, stepping over their own dead, screaming banzai as they run into American machine gun fire. This is the night that the Japanese garrison on Saipan launched their final desperate charge, and what happened over the next 15 hours would become one of the most brutal close-quarters battles of World War II. Let's set the stage because you need to understand why 3,000 Japanese soldiers chose to run into machine guns rather than surrender. Saipan is an island in the Mariana Chain, about 1,500 miles south of Tokyo. By mid-1944, American forces had island-hopped across the Pacific and were closing in on Japan's inner defensive perimeter. Saipan was critical because it could serve as a base for B-29 bombers that could reach Japan itself. If America took Saipan, it could start bombing Japanese cities. Everyone understood the stakes. The Japanese knew losing Saipan meant losing the war. The Americans knew that taking Saipan would bring them within striking distance of the Japanese homeland. The invasion began on June 15, 1944. Over 70,000 American Marines and Army soldiers landed on Saipan's beaches against approximately 30,000 Japanese defenders. The fighting was immediately brutal. Japanese forces had prepared defensive positions throughout the island's rough terrain. Hills, caves, and jungle provided natural fortifications. The Japanese fought from concealed positions, conducting night infiltration attacks and defending every piece of ground until killed. American casualties mounted quickly, but American firepower was overwhelming. Naval gunfire, air support, tanks, and artillery all combined to steadily push the Japanese back despite their fierce resistance. By early July, after 3 weeks of constant combat, the situation for Japanese forces was desperate. They'd been pushed into the northern part of the island. Their commanding officer, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, was wounded and knew the battle was lost. Japanese reinforcements couldn't reach Saipan because the American Navy controlled the surrounding waters. Supplies were exhausted. Ammunition was running low. Thousands of Japanese soldiers were dead. The remaining defenders faced a choice that seemed clear to Japanese military culture. They could surrender, which was considered shameful beyond measure, or they could die fighting. For most Japanese soldiers in 1944, surrender was simply not an option. General Saito made his decision. Rather than allow his men to slowly be destroyed in their defensive positions or face the shame of capture, he ordered a final gyokusai, a mass suicidal attack. The term literally means shattering like a jewel, the idea being that it's better to be destroyed gloriously than to survive in disgrace. Saito issued orders for all able-bodied men to gather for a final attack on American lines. The walking wounded would join. Officers who couldn't walk would be carried. Even sailors and support personnel who'd never seen combat would participate. Everyone who could move would attack. The goal was to kill as many Americans as possible before dying. If they achieved nothing else, they'd die as warriors rather than prisoners. On the night of July 6th, Japanese forces began assembling in valleys and ravines near the town of Makunsha. The gathering was enormous. Estimates range from 3,000 to over 4,000 men, making this the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War. The men gathered whatever weapons they could find. Many had rifles with bayonets. Some had only swords or knives. Others carried clubs, sharpened bamboo poles, or even bare fists. Ammunition was so scarce that many rifles had only a few rounds or none at all. This wasn't a conventional military operation. It was a mass death ritual a collective suicide aimed at taking as many Americans as possible to their deaths. General Saito didn't live to lead the attack. He and Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, the naval commander on Saipan who'd led the Pearl Harbor attack 3 years earlier, committed ritual suicide on the evening of July 6th. Saito sat facing Tokyo, drank a farewell cup of sake, and had his adjutant shoot him after he cut his abdomen with a ceremonial knife. Nagumo shot himself. Their bodies were burned to prevent Americans from capturing them. Leadership of the attack fell to lower-ranking officers who organized the men into groups and prepared them for the charge. The American forces directly in the path of this attack were primarily from the 27th Infantry Division. This army unit had been heavily criticized during the Saipan campaign for its slow progress. The 27th was positioned in a relatively flat area near Tanapag Harbor, an area that the Japanese had identified as the weakest point in American lines. 2 battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment held the front lines, with the 3rd Battalion, 10th Marines, an artillery unit, positioned behind them. The terrain favored attackers because it was relatively open, allowing Japanese forces to mass and charge without navigating heavy jungle. At approximately 4:45 a.m. on July 7th, the attack began. The first warning was the sound of thousands of voices rising in a chant, screaming banzai, and other war cries. American sentries in forward positions couldn't see much in the pre-dawn darkness, but they could hear the enemy coming. Then the first waves emerged from the darkness, running directly at American foxholes. The Americans opened fire immediately. Machine guns, rifles, grenades, everything they had. Japanese soldiers fell in heaps, but the wave kept coming. There were too many to stop with the initial fire. The human tide crashed into American lines, and the fighting became hand-to-hand. The initial impact was devastating for the Americans. Forward positions were overrun within minutes. Soldiers who'd been in foxholes found themselves fighting for their lives against multiple attackers with bayonets and swords. The mass of bodies simply swept away some American positions. Japanese soldiers weren't trying to take cover or fight tactically. They were charging straight into fire, trying to close the distance to use their bayonets. Many were killed at close range, their momentum carrying their bodies into American positions even after death. The noise was overwhelming. Screaming, gunfire, explosions, the sound of blade meeting flesh. In the darkness and chaos, no one could tell what was happening beyond their immediate vicinity. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry took the initial blow and began to collapse. Companies that had been at reasonable strength were reduced to handfuls of survivors within an hour. Radio communications broke down as operators were killed or overrun. Command structure disintegrated as officers died leading their men. The Japanese assault was achieving exactly what it was designed to do: overwhelm American positions through sheer mass and sacrifice. Soldiers who ran out of ammunition fought with rifle butts, entrenching tools, rocks, and anything available. Some fought to the death in their foxholes. Others fell back, trying to establish new defensive lines. The Marine Artillery Battalion, positioned behind the infantry, suddenly found itself in danger. The 3rd Battalion, 10th Marines had 12 105mm howitzers positioned to support infantry operations. They were artillery, not infantry. Their job was to fire shells at distant targets, not fight off an infantry assault. But as the infantry lines collapsed, Japanese soldiers started streaming toward the artillery positions. The Marines had a choice: abandon their guns and retreat, or fight. They chose to fight. The Marines lowered their howitzers to point-blank range and fired directly into the oncoming Japanese. Artillery shells designed to be fired miles away were instead fired at ranges of 50 yards or less. The effect was catastrophic for the attackers, but they continued to come. Colonel William O'Brien, commander of the 1st Battalion, 105th Infantry, became a hero that morning, though he wouldn't survive to receive recognition. When his command post was overrun, O'Brien grabbed a rifle and led a counterattack. He was wounded multiple times, but kept fighting. When he ran out of ammunition, he grabbed a saber from a dead Japanese officer and led his men in hand-to-hand combat. Witnesses later said they saw O'Brien standing on a jeep, firing a machine gun into the attacking Japanese, covered in blood from his wounds. He was killed, but his actions helped slow the Japanese advance and gave other Americans time to organize. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Sergeant Thomas Baker of the 105th Infantry performed similar acts of desperate heroism. When his company was overrun, Baker was wounded in the abdomen but kept fighting. He picked up a machine gun and held off Japanese attackers while other Americans withdrew. When he ran out of ammunition, he was carried to the rear by fellow soldiers. But Baker knew he was dying from his wounds and that carrying him was endangering his comrades. He asked to be propped against a tree with a pistol and 8 rounds. His friends refused to leave him, but he insisted on going. They left him there, alone and dying. When his body was found later, the pistol was empty, and 8 dead Japanese soldiers lay around him. Baker also received the Medal of Honor posthumously. As dawn broke, the full scale of the carnage became visible. Japanese bodies lay in heaps everywhere, in some places stacked several deep where they'd run into concentrated fire. American positions were destroyed, with dead soldiers mixed among the Japanese they'd killed. The fighting wasn't over, but the nature changed. The initial mass charge had spent itself against American defenses. Now, Japanese survivors in smaller groups continued attacking, trying to reach rear areas, while Americans counterattacked to retake lost positions. The fighting continued throughout July 7th, with both sides taking heavy casualties. The Marine Artillery Battalion performed actions that day that became legendary in Marine Corps history. When Japanese soldiers got too close for the howitzers to engage, the Marines fought as infantry, using rifles, pistols, and hand-to-hand combat to defend their guns. Some artillerymen who'd never trained for close combat fought and died alongside their howitzers. The battalion commander ordered guns destroyed rather than let them fall into Japanese hands. When the fighting was over, the 3rd Battalion, 10th Marines had suffered over 40% casualties but had held their position and inflicted devastating losses on the attackers. American reinforcements arrived throughout the morning. Fresh troops from other units moved up to plug holes in the line and push back the Japanese who'd penetrated the rear areas. Tanks rolled forward, their machine guns and cannon fire devastating to expose Japanese soldiers. Aircraft overhead, once visibility improved, began strafing and bombing Japanese concentrations. The massive firepower advantage that America possessed reasserted itself as the initial chaos subsided. By afternoon, the main banzai attack was over. But mopping up operations continued for days as surviving Japanese soldiers, many of them wounded, continued fighting from wherever they found themselves. The casualty figures tell the story of what happened that night and morning. Japanese dead were estimated at over 4,300, with most of those killed during the actual banzai charge. American casualties were approximately 650 killed and over 900 wounded. The 105th Infantry was effectively destroyed as a combat unit. The 1st and 2nd Battalions combined had only about 100 effective soldiers after the battle. Companies that started the night with 150 men were reduced to a dozen or fewer. The Marine Artillery Battalion lost 45 killed and over 80 wounded. It was one of the bloodiest single days of fighting in the Pacific War. The aftermath was grotesque. American soldiers who retook the ground over which the attack had passed found scenes of incredible carnage. Bodies were everywhere, sometimes piled in windrows where machine guns had swept back and forth. Many Japanese had been killed multiple times, shot, bayonet, and crushed as the fighting swept over them repeatedly. The smell of death and tropical heat was overwhelming. Burial details worked for days trying to handle the bodies. Some American soldiers who survived the night were never the same psychologically. They'd experienced combat at its most primitive, hand-to-hand fighting against screaming enemies who showed no fear of death. Why did the Japanese conduct banzai attacks when they were so clearly suicidal and militarily ineffective? This question puzzled American commanders throughout the Pacific War. The answer lies in Japanese military culture and the specific circumstances of 1944. Japanese soldiers were indoctrinated from childhood that death in battle was honorable, while surrender was the ultimate shame. They were told that American soldiers tortured and killed prisoners. They genuinely believed that dying fighting was infinitely preferable to capture. Additionally, their orders often explicitly prohibited surrender and required them to fight to the death. The banzai attack was seen as a way to die with honor while potentially achieving some military objective. If the charge broke through American lines and caused significant casualties or disruption, it might affect the broader campaign. More importantly, it satisfied the psychological need to die as warriors rather than be slowly killed in defensive positions or, worst of all, be captured. For the Japanese soldiers who participated in the Saipan attack, running into machine gun fire while screaming banzai was genuinely preferable to any alternative. This is difficult for Western minds to comprehend fully, but it was the reality of Japanese military psychology in World War II. From a purely military perspective, the Saipan banzai attack was wasteful and counterproductive. The 4,000 or so men who died in the charge could have mounted a much more effective defense if they continued fighting from prepared positions. Guerrilla tactics, night infiltration, and ambushes would have inflicted far more American casualties over time than one massive suicidal charge. But the Japanese commanders weren't thinking in terms of military efficiency. They were thinking in terms of honor, duty, and the cultural imperatives of their warrior tradition. The banzai attack made no military sense, but it made perfect cultural sense within the Japanese army context. The Saipan banzai attack had consequences beyond the immediate battle. It reinforced American beliefs that Japanese soldiers would never surrender and had to be killed individually to be defeated. This hardened American attitudes toward Japanese forces and may have contributed to decisions like the atomic bombings that ended the war. If the Japanese would throw thousands of men into suicidal charges rather than surrender, what would they do when America invaded Japan itself? The projected casualties for an invasion of Japan, estimates that ran into the millions, were influenced by experiences like Saipan, where Japanese forces fought to literal extinction. For the American soldiers who survived that night, the memories stayed with them forever. Many never talked about what happened. Others had nightmares for decades. The visceral nature of hand-to-hand combat, killing and nearly being killed at arm's length, is psychologically different from combat at range. Men who shot enemies 50 yards away could distance themselves from the killing. Men who stabbed enemies in the chest or bashed their skulls with rifle butts had no such distance. The Saipan banzai attack created thousands of American veterans who'd experienced combat at its most primal and carried that experience with them for life. The fall of Saipan after the banzai attack was swift. The remaining Japanese forces were mostly dead or scattered. Organized resistance ended within days. But the tragedy continued because thousands of Japanese civilians had been told that Americans would torture and kill them. Rather than be captured, many committed suicide. Entire families threw themselves off cliffs at the northern tip of Saipan. Mothers killed their children before killing themselves. The mass suicides at Marpi Point became another horrific chapter of the Saipan battle, with over 1,000 civilians dying despite American attempts to prevent it. The strategic impact of Saipan's fall was enormous. 29 airfields were quickly constructed, and by November 1944, American bombers were striking Japan. The firebombing of Japanese cities, which killed hundreds of thousands, became possible because of Saipan. The island that Japanese soldiers died defending became the launch pad for the destruction of urban Japan. General Saito's sacrifice and the banzai charge had no strategic impact. They only added to the death toll of a battle that Japan was going to lose regardless. Saipan is peaceful today. The battlefields are overgrown. Memorials mark significant sites. Japanese and American tourists visit. The relationship between the two nations has transformed from bitter enemies to close allies. But for veterans who fought there, Saipan was never peaceful. It was always the place where they faced human waves screaming for their blood, where they killed with bayonets and bare hands, where they watched friends die beside them in the darkness. That Saipan never went away. It lived in their memories until they died. The largest banzai attack of the Pacific War accomplished nothing except adding to the death toll. 3,000 men or more died in a few hours, charging into American firepower. Their sacrifice didn't slow the American advance by more than a few days. It didn't save Saipan. It didn't protect Japan. It only created more orphans, more widows, more graves. From a military perspective, it was pure waste. But the men who participated believed they were doing something noble, dying as warriors rather than living as prisoners. That belief, however misguided, deserves at least understanding even if we can't endorse it. They were human beings doing what they believed was right according to their values. That they were wrong doesn't make them less human. If this account of one of the Pacific War's most desperate nights moved you, if it showed you the human cost of cultural beliefs about honor and death, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. We're telling the stories that need to be said, the battles that shaped the Pacific War, the experiences that marked everyone who survived them. Thanks for watching, and remember, every soldier on both sides that night was someone's son. War doesn't care whose cause is just. It just kills.